I'm Jed Purdy. I teach at the law school here at Columbia. Welcome to the second and concluding installment of the inaugural Ambedkar Lectures. These are Columbia's new flagship lecture on public law and political thought. The lectures are named for Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a leader of the Indian independence movement, an architect of the Indian Constitution, and one of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century. He was also a Columbia PhD. We're fortunate and grateful to have as our inaugural lecturer Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who's currently the Lawrence Rockefeller visiting professor at Princeton for distinguished teaching, and his commentator, David Bromwich, the sterling professor of English at Yale. On Monday, Pratap set out the themes of these lectures with a series of meditations on resentment, the sense of injury and grievance that can arise from encountering a world gone wrong, off kilter, in which you find you do not fit, at least not as you deeply feel you should fit. Resentment, in this sense of grievance, is not just any political emotion. It gets its hooks into us and becomes a chronic condition, an existential state, almost an identity in itself. Sometimes, Pratap suggested, resentment may be simply something we need to outgrow, a narcissistic sense of injury at the fact that we are never at the center of other people's lives and attentions as we feel we should be, a resistance to the need to justify and give some account of ourselves to them. It may also arise from inequities that a society needs to overcome. It may be simply the grievance of a powerful person, a person of high status, angry that someone else is not showing them so-called proper deference, angry that people like them are no longer so much at the center of the social world as they once were. In both respects, resentment may be an anti-democratic poison, a refusal to accept that we actually live in a world of equals, that other people are actually different from us, are actually here, and actually matter. You might be able to come up with your own example of what this would look like in the politics of your country. I'm thinking of mine. But, Pratap suggested, there may also be something intrinsic in our democracies that drives us to resentment. The promise of political modernity is that a free community of equals could change its common life and choose its future. All of our flawed and inequitable social life moves under the implied judgment of this promise that it could be different. Yet in practice, we usually find ourselves unable to change much of anything in our collective lives, and we experience those as a sort of unwelcome fate. We find ourselves in what Pratap called the condition of being unable to accept or affirm the world as it is, and equally unable to change it. How should we not resent that condition? Today, Pratap has promised to continue probing the life of resentment in the perplexities of our politics, and to say something about how it might, just might, be neither an anti-democratic poison nor a residue of democratic despair. To think about what that might mean, we will begin by listening.
Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Jed, for a summary of the lecture, which was actually far more concise and, I think, eloquent than what was said on Monday. So, just for the benefit of those of you who weren't here on Monday, I won't, of course, rehearse the argument that I made on Monday, some very sweeping and generalized philosophical and historical claims about the nature of resentment. But I just want to set out kind of the architecture of the two talks just to place what I'll be talking about today. So in addition to the summary that Jed provided, I talked about sort of breaking down the concept of resentment and asking the question, what kind of political subjectivity does resentment in some senses signify? And I broke it down into 7 different themes. Jed alluded to some of them. The theme of freedom and authority, the theme of sympathy, the absence of a kind of shared understanding which comports with our own understanding of ourselves, the competition over status and honor, and last and most crucially, perhaps for my purposes, the theme of political agency, that underlying resentment is a consistent sense of thwarted political agency. So those were the four themes in the sense that I talked about on Monday. Today, I think I'll be a little bit less perhaps floating at 30,000 feet, talk about some specific historical instances, to amplify three other themes in relation to the idea of resentment that struck me as important, what I call the politics of personification, the politics of memory, and finally the politics of naming. And the meaning of each of these three themes, I hope, becomes clear as I proceed. I should also begin by reiterating my thanks to Columbia Law School for giving me this honor, Dean Gillian Lester, the organizers of this lecture, Professor Jamal, Greene, Professor Purdy, and Professor Madhav, Khosla, to absolutely scintillating commentators on Monday. So if you want to resent the fact that you were not able to come on Monday, I just point to the fact that you missed two fabulous commentaries by Professors Greene and Pistor. And today, particularly grateful to Professor David Bromwich, who is in a sense a teacher at large to all of us and has been for many decades. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful for David's presence. So even if bad lectures can inspire a good commentary, their work is done. I should also stress that the three themes that I'm talking about today, I hope you'll be able to get, in a sense, the argument, even if you have not been, as it were, able to access or listen to the first lecture. There could be three freestanding, as it were, interventions in their own right. Okay. So Ronald Niebuhr once wrote that Mahatma Gandhi's greatness was not in his success in bringing out nonviolent change, but, quote, his ability to maintain a spiritual discipline against resentment. For Niebuhr, this involved avoiding the one sin he thought that was common to all expressions of resentment, the personification of blame. Resentment needs a target. Someone has to be blamed, whoever it is. By the way, there is apparently a very popular video game called Blame Embodiment, in which you can actually conjure up specific figures who might be the object of your resentment. It is precisely under conditions where it is not easy to imagine what kind of politics can overcome our condition or might provide a recompense for the injustice that we experience, that we look for anything that might personify causes behind our suffering. Blaming somebody, acting resentfully towards them, provides both a sense of explanation and a feeling of empowerment. It comports well with some elementary instinct. Not just that we have been the victims of some normative expectation that has been violated, but that someone has violated it, right? In a sense, you have a reactive attitude against a particular agent or somebody you hold to be an agent. But Niebuhr complimented Gandhi for doing the opposite. Even when it was clear who the perpetrators of colonialism were, Gandhi insisted on making a distinction between the evils that colonialism perpetrated and the individuals who were involved in it. And I have to confess, I do find it quite extraordinary, the lengths to which Indian nationalism, during its anti-colonial phase, went to avoid the sense of resentment. For one thing, Gandhi insisted on recognizing the English themselves as victims, albeit in a very, very different sense, of an immoral system of modernity. And he went to great pains to insist that Indians resent neither the English nor their canon of thought. Now, underlying Gandhi's worry, in a sense, about the disfiguring effects of resentment was, I think, a kernel of a very radical kind of moral argument. We often say in religious parlance, to kind of quote the Christian language, Forgive them, for they know not what they do, right? But this is not just a religious ethic. It is, I think, fundamentally, on Gandhi's view, the basis for actually all morality. To simplify somewhat, and I'll really be kind of crude about this, there is a sense in which for Gandhi, all evil and oppression is ultimately an instance of an honest mistake. Sounds kind of odd, right? Why would we call evil and oppression an instance of an honest mistake? The proper reactive attitude to oppression, if it can be called that, is to think of it as action done in ignorance. Only with this assumption does moral knowledge or establishing some kind of reciprocity still remain a possible common ground between the oppressor and their victim. To blame someone is to actually give up on the possibility of moral repair. It's not a spur to seeking repair, it is to actually give up on that possibility. To blame is not to seek repair, it is to express the thought that repair is impossible. Only if you proceed with the assumption, this assumption about the perpetrator, is redemption, repair, or conversion even possible. If you assume, for example, that evil or oppression was carried out in full knowledge, then there is only one kind of repair possible, that is retribution. But this is at best a repair for the victim. It might perhaps empower the victim, but it does not, as it were, reestablish a moral community or put us in the space of moral justification. To blame someone is to give up on the thought that moral knowledge is still a possible common ground between us. Think of it, this way. If you blame somebody by saying you know jolly well what the good thing, right thing to do is, and you still did it anyway, right? What, in a sense, you're saying is that moral knowledge is no longer a sufficient common ground between us, right? It is, in a sense, to give up on the force of normativity or morality itself. And I think something like that thought, I think, is what Gandhi is playing with. Dwelling on the absence of resentment in this form of anti-colonialism is interesting because it reveals something about the character of political resentment. But there are also other practical issues. For Gandhi, the personification of evil, the need to attach blame, identifying it with a specific group or people, runs the risk of misunderstanding the deeper roots of the problem. In fact, one characteristic of the politics of resentment is its need to personify a perpetrator, a group that can serve as a kind of explanation for our circumstances. And Gandhi had the strong sense that this form of personification has almost a phantasmagorical character. There's something illusory about it, where the group or the person you're blaming becomes a stand-in for a real cause. So, to give a quotidian example for Gandhi, if you were interested in the problem of domination, it was more important to identify the nature of the domination than who dominated. After all, he knew well that India could still end up with English rule without the Englishmen, right? The oppressor in this sense is not a distinctive species, as it were, but part of a common predicament that we face. The project had to be to find an alternative universality that could emancipate all, rather than engage in a politics of recrimination. For Gandhi, what made a political movement free of resentment possible was a sense of confidence in one's own moral and perhaps even causal efficacy. The path of nonviolence resistance or satyagraha was the means of empowerment, the force through which agents could assert their own moral efficacy. Being resentful was for Gandhi a way of legitimizing the very values one was protesting against. What allows resentment to be overcome is the availability of a form of political action. But as Karuna Montana has brilliantly written, it is a very distinct form of political action, where the action is both the ends and the means simultaneously. For Gandhi, the answer to the conundrum of thwarted political agency that I spoke about on Monday is not to view agency as a means to an end that might or might not materialize. It is an open question whether we can succeed in remaking the world. It is an open question whether we can succeed in restoring moral community, right? And it is an open question whether we can see in the world a reflection of our choices made in concert with others. In fact, Gandhi thought that most such attempts actually fail. But what you do have control over is the remaking of yourself, and that just is the form of political agency you require, right? In nonviolent resistance, no one can in fact thwart your agency because your sense of agency is not tied to acting on an outcome. Gandhi saw resentment and the consequent blaming of others simply as a product of an intellectual, moral, and political dead end. It's an intellectual dead end because it misdiagnoses the problem. The problem is not, as it were, the person. It's a political dead end because resentment or expressing resentment in politics is never efficacious. And it's a moral dead end because it's not so much a spur to repair, but an acknowledgement of a total break. Gandhi was sometimes prepared to concede that this mode of overcoming resentment required preparation. It at the very least required courage to sacrifice oneself and a self properly prepared for the moral rigors of satyagraha. This Gandhi, of course, knew was not easy. There is, again, a very quotidian incident of a correspondent writing to Gandhi that somebody has stolen something from him. And like Gandhi, he's inclined to forgive the thief. But he writes to Gandhi that I still feel resentment at the fact that this person has stolen something from me. And Gandhi writes back to this correspondence, he says, in that case, if you're feeling resentment, you should actually report the action to the police. This was Gandhi's acknowledgement, not just that living with resentment might have an autonomous, corrosive, violent force of its own if it is not genuinely overcome, right? Okay. Now, one could argue in a cynical way, there's a little bit of a historical detour here, that notwithstanding the moral foundation of Gandhi's own lack of resentment against the English, there were other less exalted reasons for India's nationalist elite to be resentful of the British. For one thing, India's elites, even those who for the most part led the nationalist movement, were a creation of colonialism. They were actually not broken by it. Their social location, their cultural idioms of power, including adeptness at the common law, came from an intimate relationship with English institutions. They were also aware of the complicity of Indians in colonialism, as Gandhi doesn't tire of pointing out in Hind Swaraj. A personification of the English as targets and an unleashing of politics of resentment could take a course they would not like to contemplate. A politics of resentment, a politics that overcame resentment, served the purposes of a nationalist movement that was anti-colonial and progressive, but at the same time very self-consciously trying to be anti-revolutionary. Modern India's ruling class and identity was created as much by collaboration with colonialism as resistant to it. Almost all elements of India's ruling structure come out to be embedded in the colonial project. The great families from the Tagores to the Tatas, the Indian army, the Indian civil service, the legal profession, and pretty much any part of the ruling establishment displayed in some senses their indebtedness to colonial forms of power for their privilege and their identity. And even post-independence, the persistence of English and enculturation of new elites only reinforced this dependence. It was therefore prudent for this establishment to mark India's colonial subjugation, but not harp on the theme of humiliation or resentment too deeply without exposing their own complicity in this. And I think if you want to see a nice contrast, I think, just kind of teaching Fanon again last week, I was reminded of the fact that in so much of the kind of anti-colonial thought in Africa, right, there's a sequence in some senses that first you mobilize against the colonized, and then in a sense you mobilize against the national bourgeoisie, right? Because in some senses, one thing both have in common is that they are actually both complicit in structures of oppression. And you can see why Indian nationalists, if you're being a little bit cynical, might want to block that move. But was this just a matter of expediency, right? Or is there some deeper truth that even this, you might say, resort to expediency might explain? It is often a cliche to say that everyone lives in a glass house and ought not to throw stones. But in an unjust world, picking one target to blame is not itself an act of repair. It can also be a particular assertion of privilege. This is not a sufficient reason not to blame somebody, but the fact that you blame somebody out, one particular instance of injustice, might itself reflect a privilege. I'm just talking about the moral psychology here. Espousing a right cause can itself be an assertion of power. After all, whose injustice gets privileged and who is to blame for injustice is also a question of justice. As Ambedkar had asked, why does colonial oppression get priority over caste oppression? Or as cynics around the world are asking, why does Ukraine get priority over Yemen? Right? In this sense, the invocation of injustice is always selective. It speaks to two audiences simultaneously. Against the perpetrator, it seeks redress or repair. But in the eyes of others, mostly third parties, it opens up a competing economy of blame, where fighting for a particular injustice is itself seen as an exercise in privilege to be resented. The globalization of the world, or coming together of cultures, is not often a universalization of sympathy. It is, in fact, a more intense competition in the political economy of blame and injustice. There is no straightforward answer to this problem that we all face, that we are selective in our attention to injustice, natural consequence of human blindness and partiality. But in this context, does the will to resist personification mitigate the edges? Is it a way of saying, even if we are being selective, just like we are not blaming someone, don't blame us. This selectivity is a product of our common human condition of finitude, frailty, and ignorance, not a knowing assertion of privilege. Okay. Now, my invoking this real politic of tempering resentment in Indian nationalism, notwithstanding its attempts to fashion a grammar of politics beyond resentment, right? I do want to acknowledge that Indian nationalism's attempt to fashion a grammar of politics beyond resentment was an extraordinary moral and political achievement. Whatever else one may say, the intellectual worlds of Gandhi, Tagore, Aurobindo, Jawaharlal Nehru, Hansa Mehta are remarkably free of resentment. They make it a self-conscious point to warn against it. This might be a little unfair, but students in my class sometimes used to perceptively joke that there was probably more resentment in post-colonial theory and politics than there was in anti-colonial theory and politics. And there is almost certainly more resentment in contemporary invocations of nationalism, especially Hindu nationalism, than there was in early 20th century Indian nationalism. Now, this is a kind of assertion that can be debated. Does post-colonial theory really have more resentment in relation to the West than anti-colonial thought did? It's a question certainly worth exploring. But I think there is a reason that I think this charge hangs over a lot of post-colonial thinking. A creative anti-colonial movement has three things: a hopeful narrative of emancipation, a sense that the future is still in our hands, and a creative grammar of political action, where empowerment is through the active work of politics and cultural production. Perhaps sometimes, if you're lucky, even far-sighted leaders. In some ways, post-colonial resentment at our condition is a bit like the resentment of the 19th century after the French Revolution had failed, something I talked about in the first lecture. The old regime has already fallen, even though the justice that was promised at the end of it has not materialized. There is now neither political redemption nor religious consolation. No political program or grammar of action that empowers one against the condition one is seeking to dethrone, the supposed intellectual hegemony of the colonizer. In fact, in some ways, it might even be worse. The post-colonial theorist might be even more implicated in the very condition they seek to overcome. At least the anti-colonial elites were sotto voce recognizing their own complicity in oppression. Except in some forms, except in some specific circumstances, anti-colonial resentment now feels like a gesture of self-empowerment rather than a real engagement with politics. Right? And it encapsulates the argument that I outlined in the first lecture, that politics of resentment is more likely to arise when we are acknowledging that our politics is at a dead end. It is perhaps not an accident that movements like Hindu nationalism or practically any modern ethnic nationalism appropriate post-colonial resentment and take it one step further. There is one sociological fact behind the belated resentment of contemporary Indian nationalism. In an otherwise justly maligned book, Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilization, there is actually one quite prescient chapter. This is the chapter that argues that in most post-colonial societies, a revolt of rising vernacular elites against the old elites, who, even if they were not anglicized, were much more comfortable with their intellectual relationship with their colonial masters. Some of this revolt is all for the good. It is a demand for the inclusion of languages, grammars of cultural articulation, and forms of knowledge that might otherwise have been marginalized. But what this revolt against the older elites translates into a politics of resentment, because it is caught in a double impossibility. On the one hand, contemporary nationalism wants to ask an interesting question. What after post-colonial politics? What form does decolonization take, at least in cultural terms? But this question presupposes that there is some authentic expression of a decolonized cultural idiom, that speaking Sanskrit or Tamil might somehow be more authentic marker of decolonized imagination than the work of Jawaharlal Nehru. It has to mark its politics by claims to authenticity that will constantly mistake a specific cultural idiom for the whole of it, in turn creating its own exclusion. It forgets the lesson of anti-colonial politics, or it forgets the lesson that anti-colonial politics understood very well, in India at least, that under conditions of modernity, the demands of cultural authenticity and wholeness are demands that can be made only in bad faith or privilege of few. Its claim to legitimacy, contemporary nationalism's claim to legitimacy, is that it sets up a benchmark of authenticity, and anyone who does not measure up to that benchmark becomes an object of resentment. What makes the resentment even deeper is the fact that everyone knows that this politics of authenticity is being carried out in bad faith. But this is just a kind of political aside. There is, I think, a more interesting conceptual issue here, which has to do with historical memory. The question of historical memory is a complicated question and requires a fuller treatment in its own right. Almost every major theorist of resentment has made a deep connection between resentment and memory. Nietzsche, again, following Montaigne, interestingly linked an absence of memory to the lack of resentment. Living in the moment, momento vivere, is a recipe for a non-resentful life. No burden of the past, no expectation of the future. It is in some senses the ultimate religious orientation that does not instrumentalize the present moment, either through the past or the future. The great sociologist Iravati Karve, in her great reading of the Mahabharata Yugant, reminded us that itihas, history, is always linked to resentment. The bards of the Mahabharata don't let you forget anything, and the cycle of resentment continues. Or, as I had argued in the first lecture, Jean Amery had argued, resentment about the past prevents the future from emerging because it locks us in a difficult condition to undo what has happened in the past and then to define oneself in terms of it. Now, obviously today is not the right occasion, and I'm not equipped to go into the deep question that Avishai Margalit had proposed in his wonderful book, The Ethics of Memory. Is the ethics of memory, should memory be like a soul candle, as he puts it, or a tether binding us to the dead? But I want to say two remarks about memory that may perhaps reveal something about the nature of contemporary political resentment. Right? Interestingly, for both Gandhi and Tagore, but Gandhi especially, had a deep suspicion of creating a community of memory. Sometimes the community of memory is created out of necessity. The community of memory becomes important to holding on to the reality of a particular crime. But what Gandhi was suspicious of was the idea of an imagined community constituted out of a shared imagination of the past, as most modern nations are. This shared imagination almost always falsified the past. And when I say falsify here, I don't mean some quotidian sense of untruth, as nationalists often lie about the past, right? Where you believe something is false. X battle happened in 1526 where it didn't. Not that kind of falsehood. A memory about the false is a falsehood. It's an untruth in the sense that the claims of memory also can, under most circumstances, become claims of privilege, or at least perceived to be as such. Once again, as in the assignment of blame, what is remembered and who remembers it and whose version, right? This is not a question that can be settled by a fact of the matter itself. It is at one level perfectly understandable that our memories are constituted by our identification and ties. Your memory, or the memory of your community, cannot become mine, at least not in the same way, or in any meaningful sense of the term memory. So if one were trying to build a shared world under conditions of difference, would it be prudent to open up the politics of memory? Or would it be better to find the shared ground of morality? This imagination of the past as a ground for validating the identity of the community, right, in that sense is always fraught with risks. In plural societies, it can be a recipe for divisiveness more than unity. But most importantly, the narrative of the past under which community identity is generated is itself setting itself up for a political impossibility that cannot but produce resentment. By its very nature, nationalism demands identification and a resentment against those who do not identify with its stories, at least not in an appropriate way. So difference is always going to be a problem. Now, when we talk about remembering the past and forming a community of memory in relation to the past, you can think about it in two different ways. One is the way in which Jean Amery, who I mentioned last time, discussed, where I remember the past so that a crime that was committed in the past may not be committed again, or the reality of a particular crime may be acknowledged, or some form of justice be achieved, right? Here, the point of remembering is, in some senses, to tie memory to a kind of moral economy of justice in some senses, right? And that's one sense in which we think of remembering the past, right? And we don't give up on memory. But nationalist memory, right, is often a memory in a sense of a different kind. Because what nationalist memory requires is, in a sense, the undoing of something that cannot be undone. Right? It requires the rewriting of history, right, to either reevaluate or redescribe the fact of subjugation. Right? Yeah. And I think what Gandhi grasped, I think quite powerfully in some senses about nationalist memory, right, is that in that sense, it's not just the memory of thinking about a crime that happened against you in the past, right? What makes a nationalist memory distinctive is that it has to tell a new and different story about the past, where the past in some senses becomes redemptive. What was a moment of your weakness becomes a moment of your strength. What was the reality of a subjugated culture actually now becomes in some senses a narrative of past glory. And in that sense, right, it's a very different kind of memory that is setting itself up for the impossibility. How can you actually rewrite the past? How can you undo what happens in the past? It's very different from holding on to, right, the past in the service of some cause of justice. Right? So in this sense, the project of national greatness will seek validation not through the complex process of building a just nation, but through a form of displacement of past history and feeling empowered by excluding weaker groups from fantastical declarations of one's past own glory. It is not an accident that the great Hindi writer Hazari Prasad Dwivedi had a pithy phrase in the context of nationalism that might as well be described as one of the best definitions of resentment. In Hindi, it was a lot more poetic, but the English translation goes, "It's a condition when the heart is full, but the mind is empty." Right? But there are a couple of other aspects of the afterlife of the story of resentment in Indian nationalism that are of interest for this particular moment. The first is the moral psychological question. Does the attempt to constitute a political subjectivity free of resentment, sculpted by the anti-resentment spiritual discipline that Niebuhr so admired in Gandhi, actually itself generate more resentment rather than less? This question can arise at many levels. The first is at the level of tactics. The need to signal that a movement is not tainted by resentment might often prevent expressions of anger, right? In practice, it often means choosing tactics that are less disruptive and less threatening. And this was one kind of resentment that Gandhi occasioned, right? The exemplariness in being free of resentment, on Gandhi's view, is what gives one's moral claims validity. But one of the charges against Gandhi's position was that it implied a very radical kind of moral unilateralism. By moral unilateralism, I mean the idea that Gandhi prohibits any reactive attitude to the others, to anyone else. I'm not expecting a particular action or moral position from you, and therefore I have no right to be resentful, right? Remember what we discussed in the first lecture, that in some senses, resentment arises in the framework of moral expectations we have of others. But if I'm not expecting anything of you, how can I be resentful? The most important purpose of life, living for truth, is entirely within my power. And satyagraha is an affirmation of that power, right? I can hope that this might move others, but I cannot expect it. And therefore, I have no right to feel resentful or to criticize. It is the unconditionality of morality that Gandhi argues is what detaches it from an association with resentment. So this is almost the opposite of Strawson in some ways, right? What we discussed in the first lecture. More specifically, Gandhi also brought this to bear on the relationship between Hindus and Muslims. Gandhi himself generated political resentment in this context because of his stress on unconditionality. As Uday Mehta has argued, for example, in his support of the Khilafat movement, Gandhi argued the support for Muslims must stem from an unconditional assertion of friendship. And this was exactly this claim that generated a lot of political resentment, especially amongst Hindu nationalists. Surely, they argued, there must be some conditions attached to giving another group political support. But what Gandhi was bringing to his politics was his moral outlook. What I have to do as a moral matter and the appropriateness of what I have to do is in no way shaped by how others, your friends or your enemies, react. If you react violently, I will still stick to the same position and not resent you, since I have no right to demand anything from you. If you change your behavior, well and good, but you will do it for your own reasons, not because I expect something out from you. In a strange way, Gandhi is with Nietzsche on this. A life or politics free of resentment means eschewing reactive attitudes altogether. But it is not hard to imagine circumstances in which this revolt against reactive attitudes in itself occasions resentment. The unconditionality of one's own commitments itself appears as a form of suffocation. There is a second element to this moral psychology that I just want to leave on the table. Gandhi rightly thought there was a close connection between the politics of resentment and the personification of targets. So when you resent your condition, you will seek to blame somebody. Especially true in many forms of contemporary populism, right? The worry about personification is twofold. As I said, for Gandhi, it often had a fantastical character, particularly under modern conditions. Powerful groups will often blame their unfulfilled fantasies on small minorities they can subjugate, while not acknowledging the political impossibility that they face. The scapegoating that accompanies most forms of political resentment comes from this impulse. Someone has to take the blame, right? But in a way, this Gandhian approach, making a distinction between the evil and its perpetrator, or to use traditional theological language, the sin and the sinner, leaves us entirely bereft of an higher order psychological need to feel empowered. Or perhaps more strongly, as many have argued, does the will to resist personification and blaming someone leave us actually more disempowered than empowered? You can ask this question in the context of any system of oppression. Colonialism without colonialists, racism without racists, casteism without castists, exploitation without exploiters, inequality without inegalitarians, seem to often leave us as a political dead end, right? Yet personification as an explanation of our condition seems also to provoke a counter-resentment. Now, I'm not here concerned about the moral and historical validity of accusing someone of being a colonialist or an oppressor. I mean, that's, we have to exercise our moral judgment there. This is just a claim about moral psychology. Even if the accused acknowledge the validity of the critique, one can see the possibility of an unarticulated resentment simply at being accused. Because, as we saw in Lecture 1, being called to account itself is the most elemental experience of resentment. Even more so if you have the haunting suspicion that the accuser may be right. The resentment that everyone is the victim of a system may also appear to occlude from view the relevant victims here. In the resistance to personify, there is a refusal to specify a particular target and to refuse blaming altogether. But I think there's an asymmetry about this situation that bothers, I think, most political activists and critics of Gandhi. There may be no colonialists or racists to target or blame, but somehow racism or colonialism always seems to find only a specific target. The perpetrators may not be specific, but the victims always seem to be, right? And in a sense, does giving up the language of personification, in a sense, occlude this asymmetry from view? Right? But this particular worry that some might find the refusal to personify disempowering applies not just to a Gandhian disavowal of reactive attitudes of blame. It might, in a sense, apply to any abstract causal account of disempowerment of our conditions more generally. Don't blame the rich, blame capitalism. Don't blame immigrants, blame the structure of the labor market. might, on the face of it, seem a causally more sophisticated account and offer a truer diagnosis. But it can also feel extremely disempowering, right? There is perhaps a lesson in this. If the resentment that accompanies the politics of personification is to be resisted, the alternative may not just have to be a more sophisticated causal analysis. Oh, look, as the social scientist or the wonkish politician has told you, I can tell you the real cause of your condition, right? Or rather, it might be easier to accept the conclusion that our condition is politically created, whereby political we mean something identifiable, which is that there is a particular agent who has created this condition. It may be the form of political analysis that satiates the psychological need for feeling empowered, particularly when the causal story turns out to be too intimidating or forbidding to think about politically. Gandhi, of course, himself faced the full force of this politics of personification. The Gandhi-Ambedkar rivalry is one of the great moral and biographical dramas of the 20th century. Ambedkar had good reason to resent Gandhi. He thought Gandhi was insufficiently radical when it came to abolishing caste. Gandhi's example of personally transgressing caste taboos was no substitute for resolving the question of how power was going to be shared with hitherto marginalized groups. Gandhi saw the caste problem as a problem about upper caste atoning for their sins, not as a challenge to grant Dalits agency. And in the unkindest cut of all, Gandhi used moral coercion by fasting against Ambedkar's specific proposals for Dalit representation. But one of Ambedkar's arguments that we have not often paid attention to is of relevance here. Ambedkar was as sophisticated a causal thinker as one can get. But he insisted that resentment keeps alive not just the truth of, resentment is necessary to keeping alive the truth of caste oppression. And that this resentment needs a personification, which he found in the figure of the Brahmin. As Ambedkar forcefully argued, in the final analysis, no functional justification, no structural explanation can get away from the fact that the caste system was an imposition of power, pure and simple. And if it was an imposition of power, someone had to be imposing it. The claim that the system did it in some ways was for Ambedkar as much a ruse of disempowerment and a source of resentment. So my last and final theme, will be quick in this, so personification memory. This has to do with naming. Since my account of political subjectivity of resentment has invoked over the last couple of lectures Nietzsche, Gandhi, and Ambedkar, let us return to them one last time. For Nietzsche, the resentment of slave morality has its origins in the Chandal, the outcast. As many scholars have pointed out, he frequently calls Judaism and Christianity Chandal religions. For him, Buddhism is also nihilistic in its life-denying capabilities, but he thinks of it as an aristocratic religion. But as is well known, Nietzsche is a great admirer of the Manusmriti, the Code of Manu, the disciplinary text on caste. He admires Manu because Manu has a morality of breeding outside of the space of justification. For Nietzsche, all improvers of morality have the right to tell lies, and Manu is the best of them. What Nietzsche likes about the Brahmins is that they can even make the gods quiver. Now, as always, there's a lot going on in Nietzsche and a lot that is deeply problematic. But Manu is a good liar for Nietzsche because of one specific trait of Manu's. The Manusmriti is constantly classifying people. After all, caste is the ultimate form of classification, a semiotic system of signs that gives you a compulsory identity you cannot escape. But the hideous beauty of Manu for Nietzsche is that it's a form of classification of human beings that makes no reference to the subjectivity of those being classified. And that's the most important point. It's a naturalized objective classification in some senses. It is a total and objectified construction of their identity through an act of classification. Gandhi, as we well know, occasioned Ambedkar's resentment on another occasion. Gandhi famously called untouchables Harijans, literally meaning children of God, in the form of Vishnu, or Hari as the appellation. Gandhi may have meant this as an ennobling gesture, trying to convince upper caste brethren that Dalits had as much a spark of divinity in them as anyone else, and therefore in serving them one was serving God. But this appellation drew Ambedkar's ire. For one thing, he found it patronizing. But for a Dalit, it would be a reminder of Manu in so many ways. For what Manu exercised, above all else, was the power of naming. Identities are not for Manu a matter of self-definition. They have a compulsory character, in part because they are imposed through the act of naming. I once kind of electronically checked as many references to the term resentment as I could find in Ambedkar's texts, and I came up with 34 significant instances. And interestingly, a lot of them had to do with the context of the politics of naming. Through an act of naming or classification, we misrecognize others, even if perhaps we don't intend to oppress them. Any act of naming seems to abridge one's identity, especially in a context where so many scripts are associated with a name, classification, or of a social group. Names might give one an identity that might be freely embraced, but the act of being named and classified without regard to one's subjectivity can also take away the power of self-definition. Naming is perhaps the last act through which our identities are given an existence independent of us or naturalized. It is in some sense the ultimate source of resentment because it is the most oppressive, intimate, and perhaps keenly felt of all tyrannies. It is the ultimate exercise of authority by someone else, objectionable even if the content might be well-intentioned. Even in naming Dalits, Gandhi had exercised that authority. It is perhaps no accident that in the contemporary moment, the final frontier of the politics of resentment that I spoke about in the first lecture is focused around the act of naming or being denied the right to classify oneself. We often feel that we can exercise agency in the act of naming ourselves. But when the demands of self-definition, the expression of our subjectivity through a name, is at variance with how that definition is commonly understood, or that subjectivity is publicly defined, the possibility of resentment opens up. It is the point where language begins to break down. What we mean by a name and how others hear it are at variance. What might those names whose boundaries we defend, man, woman, Dalit, Hindu, Muslim, white, Indian, American, mean? Who controls their meaning? It is a commonplace now that naming is a political choice often. Sometimes it's a product of self-definition, sometimes an imposition. But naming also embodies a deep aporia of modernity that I spoke about in the first lecture. It's a political version of the debate between the nominalists and the realists in philosophy. When is a name a product of self-determination? And when do we expect it to be some kind of reference to an essence or an objective reality? What is that gap between our propensity to now think of ourselves as self-defining creatures and creatures who are classified at the same time? If names don't express an objective truth about us, what is the common ground between the speaker and listener of a particular act of naming? Rather than being portents of an identity, names are now the surest sign of a lack of shared meaning. When to name is to misunderstand or to be misunderstood, no communicative agency is possible. And that is the ultimate source of resentment, where the most human of attributes, the communication of identity, becomes impossible. As I had argued in lecture 1, there is a parallel here. It is not our performed identities that constrain politics. It is that identity is one of the few sites where we can do politics and we can, in fact, politicize. So it is with names. Perhaps lurking underneath all of this is a radical desire for self-determination freedom, where we can even define and control our own names and the meanings we attach to them. What we resent in the politics of naming is that it takes away the power of self-definition. And what we resent in the power of self-definition is that it takes away the possibility of shared meaning. And in contemporary politics, in a sense, you have both kinds of resentment at play, right? Those who want to insist on the power of self-definition, and those who think in some senses self-definition does not translate into any form of shared meaning. So what is the way out of this? I leave David Bromwich to shine the light for us. But in Ambedkar's own thinking, ironically, he actually went back to the 18th century, what I started out lecture 1 with, and to the Butler-Smith tradition that we had left behind. Ambedkar used a term which he called sympathetic resentment, an ideal kind where it is a third party that is resentful on your behalf. This was a throwback akin to what Butler in the 18th century had called indignation, which we properly exercise on someone else's behalf, where resentment is, in a sense, subject to intersubjective validation. It is something a sympathetic observer can enter into. And the function, in a sense, of resentment is to, again, find some kind of common shared ground, rather than to give up on the possibility of morality altogether. Ambedkar calls sympathetic resentment a compound of tender emotion and anger, such as those which issue out of parental tenderness when it comes face to face with a wrong done to a child. It is a kind of kinship which generates this sympathetic resentment. It was Ambedkar's very poignant way of saying that if we cut to the chase and, in a sense, give up all sophistry, resentment is a product of one thing pure and simple: the complete absence of fraternity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pratap. Please welcome David Bromwich.
Thank you. Is this about right? People can hear? These were remarkable lectures to read all as one continuous text as they were forwarded to me a few days ago. And I'm going to disappoint the expectation of shining a light that makes all things clear. On the contrary, this will run very much parallel to the observations you've just heard and that people heard on Monday from Pratap Mehta, more like variations on his theme, slightly different variations. If you have followed the recent debates about liberty of thought and discussion in the US, you will have noticed that the argument most often resorted to by pragmatic liberals is instrumental. Free speech, they say, ultimately protects us all. Try to shut up your opponents, and eventually they'll win an election and they'll go after you. This kind of response is always asking, what can we get for what we do? And it's in that sense reactive, as it's, so to speak, preemptively reactive. It depends on the psychology of resentment, which Pratap Mehta has explored with great subtlety and wisdom in these two lectures. But on free speech, as on other questions, a different response is available that is less tactical and concessive. I refuse to shut up my opponents because I recognize their unconditional right to speak their mind, and because there's something disgusting to me about the idea of me acting to shut them up. This about me would disgust me. It gives me too much power. It fortifies a tendency in myself that I want to curb and not to foster. I can't know my own motives very well, but I can enter into, and indeed can share the suspicion others will rightly harbor. Suppose we generalize this act of abstinence and say, a renunciation of power over others is required by my citizenship in a political order that embraces civic equality in principle. Such an order aims to assure equality of claims in the approval of government actions and equality of veto power over actions that are judged ill-suited to the common good. I think resentment is, as Mehta says, a reactive emotion, and I warmly agree with him that there was something extraordinary, a word he used twice, about the achievement of Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore, and others in fomenting an, after all, revolutionary change in India that did not rely on the energy of resentment. Mehta refines this insight when he adds that a kind of resentment may be provoked by a successful politics that has freed itself from resentment. This sounds like a paradox, but it seems to me unhappily true, and it may go some way to explain Ambedkar's relation to Gandhi, a point I'll return to. But the logic of, let's call it, motivated resentment, justified resentment, against a politics that has freed itself from resentment, deserves a separate description. To give up resentment altogether, to not desire and not promote the forcible weakening of a class of persons who are political opponents, is to deprive yourself of a weapon in fighting a system of inequality. The reformer who abjures resentment may respond that this strong and satisfying passion, effective as it appears in the heat of contest, is freighted, after all, with long-term moral consequences. For resentment demands for its preservation a solicitous nursing of memory, both glorious and unhappy memories. This observation, again, from Mehta strikes me as true, and I think it's faithful to Gandhi's implicit view when he declines to award a pious homage to the institutions of memory as a resource of cultural identity. The cultivation of resentful memory bears, in fact, a contradictory relationship to the ideal of political equality. The memory of injustices accumulated over time against a prescribed, subordinated, or outcast group is sometimes made to argue for reparative or compensatory measures that necessarily will create new inequalities in the present moment. Advocates of equity, as we call it, can be quite frank about this. To reverse the burden and residue of past injustices, they say, one must today give disproportioned awards to the previously suppressed group. That is the meaning of Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, saying that, quote, the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination, and, quote, the only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination. It's symptomatic that this book presents itself as a hybrid memoir and history, memory being the medium in which personal experience and history are irrefutably joined. The contest between Ambedkar and Gandhi regarding the supplementary communal award to untouchables, in fact, resembles an imaginable debate that has never properly occurred in this country between egalitarian integrationists and reparatory anti-racists. Balkanization was a result that Gandhi deeply feared from the conversion of caste into a separate political interest. But Ambedkar was unmoved by that dire prognosis and was rightly resistant from his point of view, since the threat of discord only weighs heavily against a policy if you are discussing a social order you do not wish entirely to destroy. Ambedkar was a whole-length opponent of the Hindu religion and the society and culture built around it. In response to Gandhi's objection that India already had the religious separation of voting blocks and one more subdivision might precipitate the undoing of representative politics altogether, Ambedkar could reply that the reservoir of historically justified anger was too great to admit yet one more check against the progress of social justice. A politics free of group identity, his argument in full would say, comes later in the development of social relations, when a visible basis for equality and mutual expectations of equal treatment have already been achieved. Pratap Mehta writes, and my quotations from him, there'll be a couple, come from the text that was sent to me. He said a couple of these things a little differently just now. I'm quoting him now. What Gandhi was bringing to his politics was his moral outlook. And this is Mehta paraphrasing Gandhi's outlook. I have to do what I have to do as a moral matter, and the appropriateness of what I have to do is in no way shaped by how you react. In a strange way, still Mehta, Gandhi is with Nietzsche. A life or politics free of resentment means eschewing reactive attitudes altogether, but it's hard not to imagine circumstances in which this revolt against the kind of reactive attitude which occasions resentment itself causes resentment. The unconditionality of one's own commitments appears suffocating. Interesting sentence, and I'll say it again. This is Pratap Mehta. The unconditionality of one's own commitments appears suffocating. The unconditional, and perhaps we should say it in Kantian language, the unconditioned nature of the commitment to a protest free of resentment does indeed appear suffocating if you are Ambedkar looking at Gandhi or Stokely Carmichael looking at Martin Luther King. Still, let us pause a little at that word suffocating. No one dies of such a commitment. No one stops breathing. Not for that reason. To put it a little differently then, the unconditionality of one's own commitments in a principled politics is hard. It may seem suffocating. It's hard. Harder still, maybe, is the fear of growing solitude in so strange a pursuit of thought and action. The breathing grows easier when one recognizes that the solitude is not total, and its boundaries may widen as one becomes aware of others who share the commitment at a distance. I would hesitate to characterize such people as allies. Gandhi would have called them sharers in truth. The ethic of political activism that aims to draw on feelings of resentment, and this ethic is all over the United States in the last few years and on more than one side. To draw on feelings of resentment to make them productive, in the jargon of activism borrowed from ego psychology. This ethic is interested in mobilizing, whether it says so or not, a desire for retribution or revenge. Ressentiment, the wish for revenge by the weak against the strong, is a variant of the passion that Mehta has partly in view throughout these two lectures. But ressentiment may hardly know itself as a desire for revenge. It is a rage at a pervasive indignity that finds for its target all things and all persons anyhow associated with the indignity, even in different generations, even only sharing the same color as the performers of the indignity. Francis Bacon said that revenge was a kind of wild justice, by which he meant justice that has no time to be truly just, really a kind of injustice which we pardon because we have some satisfaction in the suffering it brings. What we like about revenge is the impression of symmetry, an aesthetic rather than a moral consideration, after all. Revenge makes everything square and does it fast. We start again at zero, and next time we hope there will be time for a justice that is not wild. Why not then accept the offer of non-moral common sense, which solicits the use of resentment in the cause of actual reparation, restitution, compensation, the present righting of a historical wrong? To do so goes against the self-distancing and self-subduing morale of Socrates, Jesus, Montaigne, and Gandhi, but there are certainly precedents for making a purposeful exception. Consider victims' impact statements, for example, which have been pretty thoroughly incorporated in the American practice of criminal sentencing. A personal harm, acknowledged and returned on the head of the inflictor, is, we're expected to see, a harm that is thereby in some portion healed, compensated for. And to speak truly, something in us finds deeply puzzling the claim in the Sermon on the Mount and in Swaraj that morality is not a respecter of persons. These texts are in some ways disappointingly impersonal. By contrast, the wild justice of retribution or revenge and the turning the tables politics of resentment make the law, and by extension, a certain vision of social progress, accessibly personal. Let me reverse Mehta's order of proceeding now, though he ended up with the 18th century after all. I'm going from the text I received. And turn briefly from the 20th and 21st centuries back to the 18th, where, as he says, we derive from Joseph Butler's sermons and Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments a good deal of our thinking about the relevance of resentment to moral judgment. Peter Strawson was leaning heavily on those earlier philosophers when, in his essay Freedom and Resentment, he argued that my almost intuitive response to an unjust act directed against myself or against a person I sympathize with is itself inseparable from my idea of freedom and agency. For I cannot resent without thinking my resentment justified, and that means imputing to the person whose action I resent an intention freely followed. To resent is to interpret the purpose of an act by one person toward another. Another 18th century text, Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, has for its first meaning of resent, to take well or ill. It's just to have a sense a second time if you take it well, but you can take it ill too. And his second meaning, to take ill, and then further down, to take as an insult or an injury. 2.5 centuries later, the Oxford English Dictionary lists as its second meaning to feel deeply or sharply, to feel as a cause of pain or depression, which almost puts us on the terrain of Nietzsche's ressentiment. Here we notice the power of feeling itself to establish the truth of a complaint or a reproach. Also, like few other feelings, resentment carries a vivid transactional force. Resentment presses toward counteraction in a way that pity, for example, does not. When Ambedkar, in his great agitational pamphlet, Annihilation of Caste, wields resentment as a weapon, his position may be chosen and not forced, but the facts are on his side. This sentence from that text, that the social status of an individual by itself often becomes a source of power and authority, social status by itself a source of power, is made clear by the sway which the Mahatmas have held over the common man. Resentment there, as so often elsewhere, enlists the subjective emotion of anger to support an impartial indignation. Anger hath a privilege, says Kent in King Lear when he draws his sword against the servile steward Oswald. Resentment may deploy anger to override customary manners and usages. It sees authority itself as arbitrary, but on this issue it parts company with the chivalric Kent, I've just quoted, who, when asked by Lear, "Who wouldst thou serve?" responds simply, "You. Dost thou know me, fellow? No, sir, but you have that in your countenance which I would fain call master. What's that? Authority. Authority by its nature is not a quality that is expected to justify itself. It is, as Hannah Arendt observed, an irreducible prior fact, and its claim is invalidated the moment it tries to defend itself by persuasion or by violence. The political danger of resentment is that it converts all matters of authority to matters of power and commandment. Gandhi's authority, so far as language played a part, aimed to consist almost exclusively of descriptions of a common predicament. Exemplary action followed from that. Whereas for Ambedkar, the distinction between authority and power could be dismissed as a trick of the master morality, one of the mystifications by which oppressed or subordinated groups are talked into behavior which they are taught is correct, seemly, and high-minded. And here is another stretch of Ambedkar. The Hindus criticize the Mohammedans for having spread their religion by the use of the sword. They also ridicule Christianity on the score of the Inquisition. But, really speaking, who is better and more worthy of our respect? The Mohammedans and Christians who attempted to thrust down the throats of unwilling persons what they regarded as necessary for their salvation? Or the Hindu who would not spread the light? I have no hesitation in saying that if the Mohammedan has been cruel, the Hindu has been mean, and meanness is worse than cruelty. Where death seems preferable to integration on the available terms, the break with an existing society is complete. Resentment will infallibly convert even an apparent kindness into a calculated ruse of suppression. Naming, or to use the current term of art, misrecognition, is at once the commonest and the least retractable form of insult. When, says Mehta, to name is to misunderstand or to be misunderstood, there is no communicative agency possible, and the resulting non-communication then becomes the ultimate source of resentment. In search of an antidote, I confess that I, too, am attracted by the idea of a sympathetic resentment, since it offers a partial chance of redeeming this non-moral emotion, which has become seemingly inseparable from modern democratic politics. We should be willing to recognize that even Gandhi's disciplined followers, when they responded to his fasting, were doubtless strengthened in some measure by their resentment of what he suffered. They regretted, they repented, but they also recognized causes of the fast in the presence of illegitimate authority. Perhaps the worst feature of resentment, though, is what it does to ordinary life. Butler, in his sermon Upon Resentment, considers it, quote, as a weapon put into our hands by nature against injury, injustice, and cruelty, which may be innocently employed to help bring the offender to justice. Yet Butler saw that resentment works from the top down as well as from the bottom up, and people, once habituated to this irritable and contagious passion, will continue to indulge it when the positions are reversed. So, Joseph Butler speaks of the distemper of mind in aristocrats, for example, who are ready to upbraid their servants, quote, upon the least occasion in the world. The miniature form of resentment, says Butler, is peevishness. Peevishness, which I'm quoting Butler now, which I mention with pity, with real pity to the unhappy creatures who from their inferior station are obliged to be in the way of and to serve as a supply for it. Resentment wants more to feed on at any given moment. It's not only contagious, it is progressive. The same principle, Butler still, of resentment, peevishness, in a temper of greater force and stronger passions, becomes rage and fury. Both tempers, he concludes, can sometimes be seen in the same person. The hope of finally ridding ourselves of resentment may be unrealizable, but we ought to do all we can to purge our democratic politics of resentment in the cause not merely of justice, but of the necessary fight within ourselves against rage, fury, and peevishness. Thank you.
Thank you, David Bramlich. Pratap Mehta will now return to the podium to say a few words in reply, and then we will take questions from the audience.
I'm so grateful to David Bromwich, and as you can imagine, his comments are worth the kind of journey. And in a sense, I don't want to, I think, spoil their lasting intellectual impact in eloquence by speaking too much directly to them. I think there's just one point I think I'd raise for now, I think in response to David's just absolutely stunning comments. And I think that is this, which is the common thread that seems to be, I think, running through almost all the writers that you allude to, from Smith to Butler, Francis Bacon, actually even Hannah Arendt in a very kind of different way, right? That there seems to be this idea, which I think is broadly correct, that the conditions under which we can overcome resentment, at least one of the conditions, will be where there is some correspondence between the forms of self-knowledge that we exhibit and the forms of shared knowledge that in some sense a society exemplifies and articulates. There has to be some sense that the shared social world that we inhabit is in part our world as well, and that it is in a sense commonly created. And I think as I think discussed at sort of great length on Monday, one of, I think, the challenges of our times is that we have gone from thinking that that aspiration of building a shared politics or a shared life is a difficult one, to actually giving up on the idea altogether in some ways. Right? Because if you still hold on to the idea that that is in a sense the objective, to create a public world in common where we can also recognize ourselves, that is in some ways a way of not just disciplining your own resentment, but in a sense overcoming it through at least acknowledging some kind of reciprocity, right? Because what strikes me in a sense as worrying about resentment, and you alluded to Butler's remarks, is not just the fact that it's in a sense contagious, not just the fact that it's progressive, but at the heart of it is a certain kind of narcissism. That it is I who need to be at the center of the universe. It is the social world that needs to, in a sense, correspond to the way I imagine it to be, rather than in some senses engaging in a dialogue in others. And so the question is, in a sense, what are the resources by which reciprocity can be acknowledged as a central moral value? To me, in a sense, I think when Ambedkar is, I think, criticizing Gandhi, and I think all you said about Ambedkar was really extraordinary and powerful. But if one were to recouch it in moral terms, I think fundamentally what he's objecting to is he doesn't see that gesture of reciprocity in thinking about how Gandhi and Ambedkar make the shared world. It is that Gandhi has decided this is how the world, way the world should be in some ways. Whether right or wrong is a different question. I mean, right? It has to have this form of representation, this in a sense form of, a form of truth. I mean, that act of unilateralism in some ways, right? And that the difference in the eye of the observer between what is an act of heroic solitude, of immense integrity, right, which is really kind of in the sense where Gandhi is coming from, that solitude itself militates against a certain kind of reciprocity and recognizing the other as an equal partner in the dialogue. And in our contemporary politics of resentment in various ways, it seems to me that's the missing middle term in some ways. That either you have, in a sense, the psychological accounts, right? What are the ways in which resentment is personally disfiguring, overpowering, what it does to our politics, what it does to corrode to our politics. But what happened, in a sense, in our historical trajectory, where that very obvious and basic idea that you cannot build a common world without some acknowledgement of reciprocity, where did, in a sense, that vanish? Is that itself, in a sense, a product of being in the grip of this resentment? Or is, in a sense, resentment a symptom of, I think, something deeper where that language simply disappeared? So that would be my, I think, counter question, as it were, I think. And maybe at some point, David can come back.
Yes, let's start over here. Great, let me see your hand and I'll call on you in turn.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Mehta and Professor Bromwich. It's an extremely profound set of lectures. My question is slightly long, so I'll read it out. I think in your first lecture, you focused a lot on justification, and justification, particularly of or against blame, may become a means of holding people accountable to others who are part of the world that they inhabit. But there is a broader definition of justification, simply that of providing grounds, either for oneself or to others, for conducting a particular action. In this broader definition, justification cannot simply be the repetitive utterance of prior reasons for doing things, but it requires imaginative components too, components that can imagine both for the internal self, the self that Gandhi asked us to know and cultivate, the path of duty that can regulate our internal expectations and therefore also our judgment about the world, and for the exterior agentic self that actively endorses or contests conditions or absence of conditions through which we can accept or reject modes of powers or norms that shape how the self is in the world. Now, I want to propose that such an imaginative component requires a particular conception of reciprocity, a conception based in self-consciousness. And such a conception informed Ambedkar's justifications for his resentment of Gandhi. So for Ambedkar, a self-regarding individual that saw itself as responsible for its own independence without taking a correlative responsibility for the dependence of its authority on others would not just be solitary, but develop a structurally deficient conception of the self. And therefore, in insisting on its sovereignty, it would take all other selves that it interacts with as caught in the horizons that it sets for itself, presuming that in doing so, it is making a normative advance. So my proposition, this is a variation of what you were saying earlier in your response to Professor Bromwich, is that even if we cultivated a form of sympathetic resentment in a world that Gandhi has shaped, it would have to be conditional on a distinct conception of reciprocity, one that is self-conscious.
Okay. Thank you, Thank you for that wonderful comment. I think there's a couple of different issues here. In the first lecture, in a sense, when I was sort of talking about the demands for justification, right, it was in the context where the mere demand for justification of any kind, whether it's of the more sophisticated kind that you're talking about or, the more kind of quotidian forms, the sense that the mere demand for justification is in some senses a kind of affront to one's existence. Professor Bromwich just put it in a very different kind of way in the context of authority. Authority that has to justify itself is in a sense not authority. It's given up on the protected reasons in some senses it has. And the most elemental experience of justification is not in a sense on the content of justification. What kinds of imaginative resources would you bring to bear on the argument? It is actually the one step before that. Why do I have to justify anything? Right? In that sense, right, the demand for justification at that kind of, in a sense, psychological level, right, just the mere demand seems to question our being in freedom. Right? So that was the context in which, you're right, there wasn't an account of actually what does justification actually consist in. But it seems to me that, in a sense, the harder problem is actually, in a sense, at this level. I mean, if you can get in a sense above this, right, you're already in some senses, because if you think about justification, it in a sense already is acknowledging what you in a sense want the self to acknowledge, which is in a sense a relationship to the other, where you think of yourself in relation to that other in a particular way. It's not in a sense just an assertion of unilateral sovereignty, right? But I think the worry I have, I mean, which I mentioned in the first lecture, and I don't know what to do about it, because I can actually see the aesthetic allure of this, which is, and you know, I think this is there in Nietzsche very, very powerfully, right? Which is this deep sense of, is the demand for justification itself? Are we kidding ourselves that it is not an infringement of freedom in some ways, right? That there is that kind of a psychological allure to it, right? So, as I said in the first lecture, you may have very good reasons why you can justify yourself, right? But what generates your resentment is the fact that you're just being asked to do it, right? And I think if you substitute the word sovereignty for freedom, it acquires a pretty different kind of psychological allure, right? And I think, like with, in a sense, authority, in some senses, there's a kind of correlate there with freedom. So I think it was at that level, but you're right. There wasn't an account of justification, the content of justification.
Yes, and then Sheila Ben Habib in front.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mehta. I am alumni of JNU. I'm glad another JNU teacher is here to speak about Ambedkar. Thanks for the Columbia University arranging this lecture. I have some problems. Resentment. I heard more about Gandhi in an Ambedkar lecture than about Ambedkar. That's okay. So, but you boil down everything to resentment. I wish I had heard the word oppression. I think the base, as you say, the basis of resentment is morality. And what is the basis of morality? Religion. In India, it is the Hindu religion. So I would rather go, maybe there may be an economic basis of inequality and oppression. So I rather would have heard the word oppression. I also know about satyagraha. If anyone in this room, I have been on hunger strike for 10 days at JNU, got kicked out. I'm the one of the few that kicked out of JNU. So there is a limit to the satyagraha. I think the Irish patriots would not have died when Margaret Thatcher let them die through the hunger strike. So in the India's independence movement, Gandhi alone with his own satyagraha would not have won independence. There are other factors. I can go on, but I want to limit myself to give opportunity to others. But I think because I was born and raised there in India, and every time a husband beats up a wife or a woman, she goes on fasting, and the husband goes on, begs and takes her back. I think it is partly in the Indian culture to go on hunger strikes and do satyagraha. It's nothing Gandhi invented himself. It is there in the culture. His wife used to do that. He just borrowed it. So far as my understanding concerned. I used to be a Gandhian. I used to shave my head and wear a khadar and all that thing, but nothing personal. So I know a little bit about it. So resentment is everywhere. You know, I was associated with the Native Americans.
Thank you.
And
Pratap, you want to reply?
I mean, you've already asked lots of big questions. Just two quick things very quickly. I mean, one, this is not the occasion. We can go into a discussion of sort of what the sources of oppression are. And one thing I did want to actually clarify, which was part of the first lecture, was it's not as simple as oppression occasions resentment. In fact, part of the point of the first lecture was actually that most of the instances of political resentment that we actually encounter have relatively little to do with oppression in the classical sense. I think it's also, a little bit a mischaracterization of the phenomenology of struggles against injustice to kind of automatically assume oppressed equals resentful. In fact, what makes resentment interesting is precisely that equation is not as easy, I think, as what Professor David Bromwich was suggesting. But we'll probably need a much longer JNU seminar on this.
Shayla Ben Habib. Could you bring Charity of the microphone? Thanks.
A pleasure to listen to you both. I want to shift to a theme that was spoken about briefly, but you said you can't elaborate it too much here, and that was about the ethics and politics of memory.
Yeah.
I sit here thinking of Ernst Renan, on doit avoir oublié. One needs to have forgotten, and one cannot have a nation or a civic community if that's not the case. But I also thought of Walter Benjamin. History is always the history of those who won out.
Yeah.
Now, I think we need to go into the ethics of memory a little bit more deeply and not just see it as a manifestation of ressentiment and just recuperating by the weak, those who have been excluded, etc. And I'm thinking that memory goes together with collective and individual, with the inevitable need for human narrative. There is no self that does not narrate itself, that does not tell a story about itself. And that's so fundamental. So in that sense, yes, the ethics and politics of memory, but I think a bit more openness and sympathy towards the attempt to try to recoup a tale that I can live with and a tale that I can tell my children and other generations. So I was a bit unsettled by the kind of critique that there's too much rewriting of history, there's too much competition around historical memory, and I want to say, why not? There is a good moment of resistance and maybe an emancipatory moment in that.
No, thank you. Absolutely appropriate point, and I think it is something I should have taken more seriously rather than and I do admit I think the way I articulated was probably a little bit flippant. So a couple of thoughts on that. I think there are three aspects, in a sense, of the politics of memory that I think we would probably both agree are not just inevitable, but in some senses quite productive. Right? One, as you said, in a sense, we all live by stories, and we have to tell some story, and even communities have to tell some kind of shared story in some ways about what it is that makes this community a community of fate or something. The second is, in some senses, as you rightly said, a lot of the politics of memory in this contemporary moment is a kind of revolt and opening up of suppressed histories in ways. It's a form of resistance against victors' histories in some senses. So there's, and in some senses, what makes it so charged is actually not the sense that they are actually falsifications, but the realization that some of these claims actually might be true. I mean, that's the source of the resentment, in a sense of opening up the politics of memory, right? But in some ways, I think it's an interesting question, which is, to what use is that politics of memory being put? I think I'm sympathetic to the idea, as a kind of sort of insensitism was implicit in your remarks, where it is very clearly identifiable, identifiably associated in the service of, let's say, the production of truth in some ways, right? So when we think of bringing to the fore histories that had been hitherto marginalized, you're not just bringing visibility, you're in some senses connecting the historical record, right? Where there is, in a sense, a kind of prior ethical commitment in some ways, right? That what is involved in this enterprise, right, is not the weaponization of memory and history to claim a particular kind of privilege or to claim which might also under some circumstances be justified. But it is in some senses tied to some old-fashioned notion of truth in some ways, right? That it is part of our integrity, right? And that's fine. But if it were that, then that would be a politics that would be governed by the canons of that shared truth-seeking in some senses. What are the conditions under which these claims can be, I think justified? And maybe some of that is going on, and I think some of that is that. And I also understand that often the motivations for doing that may actually just come from particular political, the privilege of particular political groups, but they can transmorph into, as it were, truth and, I think, validity claims. The specific kind of politics of memory that I think worries me is one which I do think is characteristic of at least most contemporary nationalism, which is, in a sense, it's not the articulation of the truths in the service of, in some senses, truth and justice. The whole project, in a sense, is underlying not just a particular privilege, right? But in some senses manifestly then using that privilege in relation to suppressing other histories and communities, right? And you might say one hallmark of test of the sincerity in some senses of that memory, right? Whether it's being actually carried out with, in a sense, a sincere purpose, would be to actually subject to this test of democratic validation and subject to the test of truth, which is that insofar as you are recognizing your own need for narrative, your own bringing to the fore marginalized and suppressed histories, would you, in the process of writing that history, extend that same courtesy to everybody else who might be engaged with that history? And it is often the case that a lot of movements that use the politics of memory actually fail that elementary test in some ways. But that's a political judgment. That's not a moral claim about, in some senses, I think the nature of memory. But there's one other aspect, in the sense of, I think, the politics of memory, which is when we say there is a human need for stories, and often even redemptive stories, a usable past, to use Bosma's phrase. I mean, we all kind of require usable past at some level. I think the worry about that is the quick move from saying that the way in which you can get a usable past is, in some senses, to relive and undo the past, or at least create some kind of fantasy where not is the past just being rewritten is, in a sense, a matter of history, right? But in a sense, your own conception of what historical truth is, right, actually becomes entirely subservient to the needs of that present identity. So it's the identity in chase of a structure and belief. What I think about 1526 is a function of who I am. It's not, in a sense, a function of a... And I think a lot of the sort of the resentful politics of memory is actually in that space. And unfortunately, probably the more dominant form in which it is actually articulated, rather than in the kind of dialogic and democratic form in which you would probably want it, which is, in the sense, as the advancing of truth claims, that we can then, in some senses, try and intersubjectively adjudicate to create actually workable memories for the purpose of taking the community forward.
Great. I see 5 people now, and we have about 15 minutes together. So I am going...
Should we take 2 or 3 questions together?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. I'll ask your indulgence in the spirit of sort of continuous conversation to start back here, and then I will come to Ashraf, Ahmed, and Karuna Mantana, and then we'll see where we are.
Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I listened to you today and regretted that I was not able to make the first lecture. My question really follows on the question that Shayla Ben Habib just posed to you about the ethics of memory. But I want to ask it conceptually. It seems to me that one thing I did not hear you make is a distinction, a very important distinction, between national memory and national myth, right? So I want to say that if one makes that distinction, one might tell a very different story than the story that you told us today about the relationship between memory and the politics of resentment. I think that other story, a story about memory, is a story that embraces a conception of the work of memory, right, that is captured by Herbert Marcuse's insight, that the restoration of remembrance to its rightful place is one of the noblest tasks of thought, right? So one could say that memory is precisely about thinking about and, as Adorno would say, or the working through the past, not undoing it, right? Yeah. Whereas myth is about undoing the past in your formulation. Yeah. So there's something like a connection between working through the past and the project of collective remembrance and the practice of public freedom, right? And to the extent that there is a relationship between those two, my question would be, couldn't one argue that there's something like a constitutive connection between memory that is about thought versus myth-making that is about a kind of thoughtlessness, right? Something like a constitutive connection, not an opposition, between memory and modernity, right? Because that kind of working through the past makes possible a kind of shared literacy, civic literacy. Right? It's an educational project which, as the word education, the etymology of the word education suggests, is about leading us out of, right? Leading us out of the kind of closed and conflictual political relationship that's all about identity, right? So the distinction between memory and myth seems to me to be a very important one. And I didn't hear you grappling with that in your lecture. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let us come forward to Ashraf is right here, and Karuna.
Hi. Thanks for your lecture. I wasn't here for the first one, so my apologies if my question had been answered in that one, but I think it's relatively self-contained. Essentially, I'm curious about the connection between moral psychology and substantive morality in the 3 models you've presented. The first being Gandhi, where resentment is unjustified because immorality, even inflicted on you, is an epistemological error. So therefore, one can't resent if you understand what moral error is correctly. The second model, call it Nietzschean, would be one where resentment gets in the way of a more valuable form of life, one of, let's say, energy, spirit, aestheticism, whatever. So resentment should not be embraced because it's a more impoverished form of life. And then the third, which would be the moral psychology tradition, especially the Scottish Enlightenment, that both you and Bromwich, I think, are congenial, sort of seems somewhat congenial too, but I won't say endorse, which is one that conflates moral psychology with substantive morality and whatever meta-ethical issues that come with that. Let's say you reject all 3 models. Then what would one take from the picture of resentment that you've presented? Is it simply a practical issue in post-colonial societies or societies ruptured by disagreement.
And Karuna is right here.
Let me see if we can. I think I wanted to just say something more about personalizing in Gandhi. And I think one of the things that is maybe ironic, or maybe it's a necessary feature of successful satyagraha, was in some ways these systems, and I would say King too, they were already personalized. So you already had a very clear sense of, as you say, who the antagonists were. And it's in those situations where you need to depersonalize. In order also, though, I think Gandhi and King both also wanted to solicit those who are in power to see them, to actually indirectly personalize again. So, for the upper caste Hindu to recognize their implication in systems of domination. And that requires a kind of, I think, so it's not really depersonalization entirely. So I think one way I would just ask the question is, what's the opposite of a reactive attitude? And I think here, Gandhi and King were soliciting those in positions of privilege or an observer to personalize and then internalize, in some sense go through the self to think through their implication and their obligation. And maybe I would say, as David said, to think of what this duty is to themselves. And so that's actually, the end point is a kind of deep personalization and also a rethinking of identity. So it seems like in some ways, even if it's against resentment, it is about another way of conceiving, whether you'd call it the politicization of identity. It's not, it is, in the first lecture, I think you talked, there are different forms of politicization of identity. And maybe what we need to also think is resentment is one form, but there may be other forms of politicization that can't be totally political. They have to have some other non-political or moral or ethical incentive, and that's more of the challenge of, so I guess another way to ask is, what would be the opposite of a reactive attitude?
Great. Thank you for the three wonderful questions. I'll go in reverse order. So, I mean, if I hear you right, Karuna, I think that's a very helpful correction. But in a way, it's actually, I think, an extension of the unconditionality point, right? So different way of looking at it, which is that if the only reason those who are in position of oppressing others or oppressing others are actually changing their position is some kind of threat or some kind of assertion of power on behalf of another group, that could bring about change, but in a sense, it's not the right kind of change. It's displacing, in a sense, one form of power over other. So you might actually say then that the test of the successful instantiation of justice or moral transformation is that for even those who are, in a sense, undergoing it, in a sense, it has to be unconditional, right? I'm not doing it because, I'm not doing it instrumentally, I'm not doing it in some senses. So in a sense, their transformation has to mirror Gandhi's self-transformation in some ways. So in that sense, the structure actually remains, I think, the same. I mean, it's, in fact, I think read your point as, in a sense, I think deepening that issue of, in a sense, deep, personalizing, where even the oppressor does not have in mind a particular type. I mean, as David Bromwich rightly said, it was not in a sense about victim statements. It's not in a sense about a particular target in some ways, that, a contingent move of sympathy or a fear of power. It is actually a genuine, in some senses, internal transformation. And to that extent, in a sense, it's unconditional. So for me, the opposite of reactive, as I'm using in this context, is in a sense unconditional. And in a sense, it's not dependent upon the move anybody else makes in this game. Actually, so I would, I guess, appropriate your reformulation, I think, for the same argument. Your question about the three forms of moral psychology, very kind of, three positions very eloquently described. I'll just say two things. I mean, it's a very, very big question, right? One, I think the purpose, particularly in the first lecture, which was less in a sense on Ambedkar and Gandhi, in fact, barely mentions them at all. It is more on the general moral psychological structure of resentment, was to actually say that one can perhaps get a better understanding of the idea of resentment if one actually breaks it down into different kinds of sources, right? And those are the 7 fables. In a sense, resentment in relation to authority, status and power, and so forth. It's a different way, in a sense, of carving out, rather than kind of thinking about resentment as such. And then what that allows you to do is actually think of what is the political problem that's specific to each of those forms of resentment. So the problem, in a sense, of the relation of resentment to the question of authority and justification, right? In some senses, there's a parallel to, for example, how it arises in the context of naming, in a sense which the parallel is, in a sense, both are latching on to some kind of unilateral power of self-definition and freedom, right? But the kind of responses, moral and political responses you might think of to each of these would have to be, in a sense, be specific to those. Now, I'll just say one thing about the 18th century tradition, which I did say in a sense the first lecture, which is that, I mean, I talked about that at some length actually in the first lecture, that the 18th century, thinking broadly in some senses, right, resentment was placed in an economy of shared understanding, right? So that's partly what makes it amenable to adjudication by an impartial spectator. You can ask the question, when is resentment justified, right? What is the shared forms of norms of understanding in light of which it is justified? The appeal, in a sense, to the impartial spectator or a shared understanding also was thought to be a mechanism by which you can then modulate your resentment. What's the perfect pitch in should be expressed? And they were ambivalent about whether you can do it. I mean, I don't think both Butler and Smith, as David Bromwich pointed out, it still retains a power that's independent of it being contained, in a sense, in this moral economy, right? But in a sense, what about those conditions? And there are moments in their texts as well where you actually see these conditions, where the purpose of articulating resentment is not, in a sense, appealing to a norm that we already share, in light of which my resentment can be understood by everyone and then adjudicated, right? Which is, for example, the way they use the concept of resentment in relation to legal punishment. The community understands my resentment, right? There's a kind of different kind of form of resentment where what you resent is not the fact that in light of some shared expectation, a particular injury has occurred. It is you have given up on the possibility, or you do not envisage the possibility of there being a shared norm at all, right? Which is a much, in a sense, much more existential, deeper kind of resentment. And often that can also be a product of social distance. I mean, if you think of Smith's discussion of poverty, for example, right? I mean, in a sense, resentment fails you when you need it the most, right? So that's the sense in which, and that tradition, in a sense, kind of comes to an end in the 18th century at one level. I mean, it's supplanted in the 19th century by all kinds of other things. And then, of course, there's the Nietzschean critique of that, how do these passions get formed in the first place? So I actually don't think you can actually derive, in a sense, the moral content from that moral psychology. Your question, sir, I mean, truly extraordinary, and I think your intervention would be a nice small paper in its own right. Couple of things in response to that. It obviously requires a much, much fuller answer. So you're right. I mean, I think there's a distinction to be made between national myth and national memory. But when I heard the term national myth first, I actually thought of two distinctions within the concept of myth as well. And maybe this might actually perhaps explain why I placed emphasis on one as the other. So when we think of myth, national myths, one can think of it in two ways. One, we think of myth as, in a sense, the opposite of a truth, right? So your conception of history is entirely mythical, as we say colloquially, right? It's not based in facts. You've made this up, right? And of course, a lot of the contemporary reaction is against that kind of myth-making about history. But there's another sense of myth, which is, you might say, the more Platonic sense of myth, which is it a form of expressing a particular truth about us as a community that we can't express in purely propositional and factual terms, right? So another word for this might be national ideals rather than national myth in some ways, right? I mean, think of constitutions in some senses as national myths in that sense. They don't objectively describe the workings of society, right? It's actually not clear what their foundations are in some senses. But they do express a certain kind of truth about, or at least a moral truth about the terms of the social contract in a sense in which we want to move, I think, forward, right? And I think one of the interesting things, I think, that thought that occurs to me as you were speaking is the project of constructing a shared memory, right, which is in a sense does justice to the project of constructing that memory that we share. Would that actually be facilitated if there was actually a consensus on what is this engagement with memory in service of, right? In a sense, does it need that myth that in a sense binds us together as a kind of operative principle to perhaps impose some discipline, to perhaps in a sense mobilize the power of memory for the purpose of creating a common world and a constructive citizenship? But I mean, I know this is a very inadequate answer, but I'll think about what you said a great deal.
I must apologize to those who've had their hands up, but I'm obliged to bring us to a conclusion of 2 extraordinarily rich days of conversation. Pratap, David Bromwich, and I and the rest will be behind this unsettling banner for a reception. Thank you so much, Pratap, for joining us for these Tuesdays. It's just been absolutely wonderful. David, thank you so much for coming to be with us. Katerina, thank you for the comment on Monday, and thank you all for being here and for really producing a sort of continuous conversation about very difficult and very important questions over these days. Thank you.
Thank you.